being provided by the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. I just wanted to let you know is that the session is being recorded, and throughout the evening, I'm going to provide a few of the details. There will be a presentation by two of our municipal advisors, and at the end of the presentation, there will be an opportunity for a Q&A. So you can submit questions through the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little Q&A button, and all of those will be responded to at the end of the session. If you could keep your questions more towards the content of the presentation or regarding legislation, that would be appreciated. And that any questions regarding process or procedure, if you can direct those in the coming days to your respective clerk's office, they can respond to them directly. So now I'll introduce you to all of our clerks who are with us this evening. If I could ask the clerks to turn your cameras on. Okay, so we have Lee Parkin from the town of Innisfil. We have Diane Gould-Brown from Agilitas Orontico. We have Lisa Lair from ESSA. We have Pam Fettis from New Tecumseth, and we have Rebecca Murphy from Bradford West Gwillimbury. And these are your clerks, and if you have questions, you may direct them to the clerk's office or to the clerk specifically. Thank you, clerks. Now I will introduce you to our municipal advisors. We have with us this evening Savroop Johal and Bridget Foster. So I will turn the meeting over to you, and I will come back for the question and answer session.
Thank you so much for that, Patty, and welcome to everyone. Barbara, if you don't mind displaying the presentation whenever you can. Thank you. So hello, everyone. My name is Sav Johal, and I have with me today Bridget Foster. We are municipal advisors from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, and we're here to present information for candidates, third-party advertisers, and school board trustees pertaining to the 2022 municipal elections. We'd like to thank all the municipalities involved today for planning and hosting the session, and we'd like to thank you, attendees, for your time in being here today. Also, congratulations for taking an interest in your community and in local government. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I have some housekeeping notes to share. The first one being that these slides are meant to be a summary of some of the sections of the Municipal Elections Act and Municipal Act, and should not be relied upon for legal or official purposes. I'd like to stress that we are not lawyers and that you should always consult the legislation and seek legal advice when necessary. Additionally, we will not be able to cover every aspect of municipal elections today, but hope that this presentation provides you with a better understanding of the campaigning process and relevant legislation. Again, to save time, I may give a high-level summary of some of the slides, but I do recommend that you take a copy of this presentation. I believe the municipalities are making it available online, and read it again at home in detail. Also, at the end of the presentation, there are links to the 2022 Candidates Guide, Voters Guide, and Third-Party Advertisers Guide. And those guides cover most of the information we will discuss here and provide more details and examples. So I highly encourage you read those as well. As you know, we are virtual today, so if we do happen to get disconnected due to internet issues, we do have a plan in place to come back online, and we would just request your patience in that situation. Fingers crossed that doesn't happen. Next slide, please. So this slide outlines the topics that we will be covering during this session. As mentioned before, we request that you please hold your questions until the end of the presentation, or you can type them in the chat box, but we will get to them at the end of the presentation. If we're unable to get to your question, or if your question is very specific to a certain situation you have, our contact information is listed at the end of the presentation. So please send us an email or a phone call at any time, and we would be happy to assist you. And that includes later on in the year as well. Anytime you have election-related questions, please reach out. And with that, I will jump into today's presentation. Next slide, please. Section 2 of the Municipal Act stipulates that municipalities are created by the province to be responsible and accountable governments with respect to matters within their jurisdiction. As many of you are planning to become council members, you may want to take a quick scan or an in-depth read of the Municipal Act for more information on the powers and duties that a municipality has. On the second last slide of this deck, there is a link to the relevant pieces of legislation that council would refer to. Next slide, please. This slide illustrates the relationship between council and staff. Before we get into the information about campaigning, in the next few slides, we're going to briefly touch on the role of the mayor, the role of council, and the role of municipal staff, as well as the relationship between all three, which is key to an effective and efficient local government. We encourage you to read the slides in more detail at your own leisure. Next slide, please. Council has many roles, which are listed in this slide, as well as the next. They're also found in the Municipal Act. Some of those roles include maintaining the financial integrity of the municipality, ensuring the accountability and transparency of the operations of the municipality, and determining which services the municipality will provide. Next slide, please. Council also conducts meetings, passes bylaws, and develops policies. It's important to remember that these decisions are made as a collective group, with all members of council, including mayors and deputy mayors, only having one vote, and the affirmative outcome becomes the strategic direction for staff. I mentioned that the Municipal Act sets out the many responsibilities and limitations for council. Your municipality's procedural bylaw also outlines the specific policies that your municipality has adopted when it comes to making decisions at council meetings. So again, that is another document that you may wish to refer to better understand your future role as a councillor. And the procedural bylaw can be found on your municipality's website, or you can reach out to your local clerk for that document. Next slide, please. I previously mentioned that although all decisions must be made as a collective group, there are some differences between the role of the mayor and councillors. The mayor is the figurehead for council. Again, that doesn't mean they can make decisions by themselves, but they do represent the municipality at official functions. They preside over council meetings so that its business can be carried out efficiently and effectively, and they provide leadership to the council. Next slide, please. Mayors also promote the purposes of the municipality and are key figures in public involvement. Next slide, please. The role of staff is set out in Section 227 of the Municipal Act. A key feature of effective and efficient councils is a well-developed understanding of the council-staff relationship and the role of each party. As we discussed, council provides direction, but staff implements council's decisions, and they do that by establishing administrative practices and procedures to carry out council's decisions, undertaking research and providing advice to council on policies and programs of the municipality, and carrying out duties as required by legislation or other duties assigned by the municipality. It's important for you to know that some municipal staff positions, including those of the clerk, the treasurer, the chief building official, and the fire chief, have statutory obligations. It's important that council does not interfere with those statutory obligations. Next slide, please. The function of the CAO, or the Chief Administrative Officer within the municipality, is similar to the role of a Chief Executive Officer in a business environment. The CAO is responsible for the general control and management of the day-to-day operations of the municipality. This may include developing and implementing appropriate internal administrative practices and procedures to ensure the efficient, effective, and accountable operation of the municipality. To help understand the role of the CAO in a municipality, picture an hourglass. Council is at one end and all municipal staff are at the other end. The CAO is in the middle, the smallest part of the hourglass, which the sand must pass through. So if council wants to give information or direction to a specific staff member or department head, the communication would flow through the CAO. Likewise, if staff wanted to give council information or reports, that would flow through the CAO to council. Next slide, please. It's also important to understand the role and responsibilities of an elected official, which is why the next few slides are included in this presentation. However, today's session is focused on campaigning and we have a lot to cover. So I'm going to quickly go through the next slides pertaining to your potential future role as a counselor, but I encourage you to read these slides later in your own time. Also, refer to the counselor's guide, which again is linked in the references section at the end of the presentation. The slide here provides you with a high-level overview of the relationship between council and staff. In general, it is the role of the elected council to represent the community and set the direction and policy for the municipality. It is the role of staff to manage people and resources to achieve council's vision. The relationship between staff and council is interconnected, and it's important for council members and staff to respect one another's roles so that they can serve the public in an effective and efficient manner. Next slide, please. It's also important to remember that you are elected by your constituents to represent their views when dealing with issues that come before council. However, your constituents will have many views and opinions, and you cannot represent all of them all of the time. For many issues, you will have to consider a variety of opposing interests and make decisions that will not be popular with everyone. You should use your judgment and decide based on the interests of the municipality as a whole. Next slide, please. This slide outlines the general processes undertaken when developing policies. Next slide, please. Another important role for a municipal council is to ensure that the municipality's financial and administrative resources are being used as efficiently as possible. Next slide, please. Ontario's municipalities and members of council operate under a legislated accountability and transparency framework that includes rules for the municipalities and rules for members of council and local boards. Ensuring accountability and transparency of the municipality is one of council's roles under Section 224 of the Municipal Act and is a priority in maintaining public trust. Councillors are, of course, accountable to the public as elected officials. This slide outlines the policies that council is required to adopt to support that framework. Next slide, please. Every municipality has a code of conduct that sets out expectations and standards for councillor conduct. You may wish to look up the code of conduct for the municipality that you are running for and familiarize yourself with its requirements. Next slide, please. Municipalities can have a variety of accountability officers as part of their transparency and accountability framework, including a closed meeting investigator, an auditor general, and an integrity commissioner. An integrity commissioner operates independent of council and reports to council with respect to the application of the code of conduct of members of council and local boards, as well as procedures, rules, and policies governing the ethical behavior of members of council and local boards. Next slide, please. The Ontario Ombudsman also has a role with respect to municipalities. More information about the Ontario Ombudsman can be found on this slide. Next slide, please. Personal privacy and other confidentiality issues are an important practical and legal consideration for municipal councillors and staff. The Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act is the primary statute for privacy and confidentiality. It sets out rules for collection, use, and disclosure of personal information. With that, I am concluding the portion of the presentation pertaining to council and staff roles, and we're going to be switching gears to election campaigning, starting with the role of a school board trustee. Next slide, please. The Education Act creates 4 different kinds of school boards, which are listed on the slide. School board trustees are members of the school board. They are locally elected representatives of the public, and they are the community's advocate for public education. Only the board, not an individual trustee, has the authority to make decisions or take action. A trustee is often the first point of contact for parents and community members who have questions and/or concerns about their local school. Candidates should contact the applicable school board for further information about their duties and commitments. School board trustees, that is. Next slide, please. The role of a school board trustee is to establish policy direction and participate in making decisions that benefit the entire school board while representing the interests of constituents. School board trustees are accountable to constituents, the Ministry of Education, and families. It's important to note one major difference between school board trustees and municipal candidates. If a municipal candidate works in a municipality, they cannot run in that municipality without taking a leave of absence, but they can run in any other municipality without taking a leave of absence. For a school board trustee candidate, if you are employed in any school board and you decide to run for a school board trustee position, you must take a leave of absence, even if it's for a different school board. Now, that being said, all employees of municipalities or school boards who wish to run for office should check with their employer for any policies or procedures that the municipality may have in place about that situation. Next slide, please. In order to run for office for a municipality, you must be an eligible elector, which means you must be able to vote. So the list on this slide shows both voter eligibility as well as eligibility to run and hold office. Next slide, please. This slide also lists the eligibility requirements for a school board trustee to be eligible to run. I just want to stress it one more time. If you are an employee of any school board and you wish to run for a trustee position on any school board in the province, you must take an unpaid leave of absence before you file your nomination form. If elected, you must resign from your job. You cannot work for a school board and be a trustee in Ontario at the same time. Questions about school board eligibility should be directed to the school board secretary. Next slide, please. Third-party advertising refers to advertisements or other materials that support, promote, or oppose a candidate, or support, promote, or oppose a yes or no answer to a question on the ballot. The meaning of third party in this context means a person or entity who is not a candidate, but is still an entity advocating for issues related to a municipal election. Third-party advertising is separate from any candidate's campaign and must be done independently from a candidate. A third-party advertisement is an advertisement in any broadcast, print, or electronic or other medium that promotes, supports, or opposes a candidate or a yes or no answer to a question on the ballot. Advertisements include traditional ads as well as materials such as brochures or signs. Activities that do not involve spending money, such as discussions or expressions of an opinion about a candidate, are not considered to be third-party advertising. So examples include speaking to friends and neighbors, posting on social media such as Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, or sending an email to a group or mailing list. So as you can see, no financial activity is tied to those activities, so it's not third-party advertising. Next slide, please. Only the following persons and entities are eligible to file a notice of registration: an individual who is to become a third-party advertiser, an individual who is normally a resident in Ontario, a corporation that carries on business in Ontario, a trade union that holds bargaining rights for employees in Ontario. Groups like associations or clubs that are not incorporated cannot register to conduct third-party advertising. Next slide, please. The first day for filing nominations is May 1st, 2022. Note that this is a Sunday, so in Simcoe County, the clerks will begin receiving nominations on Monday, May 2nd, 2022. The last day and time for filing nominations for the 2022 municipal election is on Friday, August 19th, 2022 by 2 p.m. If a candidate withdraws a nomination, they are still required to file a campaign financial statement covering all of the financial transactions made in the campaign. Even if you haven't spent any money or raised any funds, even if your campaign was only 2 days until you withdrew, you still have to submit that form. It is very easy though, because there's a button that you click that says, no expenses or funding was raised, and then you sign the form and submit it. Bridget will go into more detail later on in the presentation about that. If a nomination is withdrawn, the candidate is entitled to a refund of their nomination filing fee only after they file their financial or auditor statements by the required deadline. In the candidate's guide, the ministry has provided a few examples showing what happens when candidates change their mind about which office to run for after they filed a nomination paper. So again, I would highly recommend that you read the candidate's guide, as it does go into more detail about each of the requirements for nomination. Next slide, please. Starting on May 1st until the close of business on August 19th, 2022, nominations can be submitted to the clerk from anyone who meets the eligibility criteria to run for office. Candidates must complete Form 1, the nomination paper, and submit it to the clerk along with the applicable nomination filing fee. The filing fee is $200 for anyone running for the head of council and $100 for all other offices. The clerk must be satisfied that you are eligible to run in order to certify your nomination. To do so, the clerk can ask you to show identification or fill out additional forms to prove that you are eligible to run for that particular office. If your nomination is not certified by the clerk, your name will not appear on the ballot. Additionally, the nomination form must have original signatures. If you live in a municipality with wards, as long as you are eligible to vote in the municipality as a whole, you may run in any ward. If you do run in a ward where you do not live, you won't be able to vote for yourself, as you must vote in the ward in which you reside. So that's one vote you would lose. With regard to electronic filing, we understand the County of Simcoe, the municipalities present today will not be allowing electronic filing, so you will be required to go in person to file when needed. The first day that a candidate may file a nomination or that a third-party advertiser may register is May 1st. Next slide, please. Municipal council candidates are required to obtain 25 nomination signatures on their Form 2, unless the municipality has less than 4,000 electors. If the candidate wishes, they can also provide more than 25 signatures. The requirement for nominators to sign nomination forms does not apply to school board candidates, only municipal election candidates. Nominators can nominate more than one candidate, and they're not required to vote for that candidate. Nominators must meet the eligibility requirements of a municipal elector at the time that they sign the nomination form. So they must be of voting age, reside in the municipality, etc. In a ward system, the nominator can be anyone who is eligible to vote in the municipality, not just that specific ward. Both the clerk and the candidate are entitled to rely upon the information provided by the nominator. However, if the nominator did not meet the eligibility requirements when they signed the document, they could be held accountable under the penalty section of the Municipal Elections Act. So as a candidate, you may want to let nominators know that before they sign and confirm with them that they meet all requirements. And again, candidates should remember that they are required to obtain 25 original signatures, even if electronic filing was permitted, and to keep those until after the next regular election in 2026. Next slide, please. Occasionally, a candidate changes their mind and decides to run for a different office. You can only run for one office at a time. If you file a second nomination for another office, the first nomination is deemed to be withdrawn. If you filed your second nomination in another municipality, you may want to contact the clerk of the first municipality to let them know out of courtesy. If a candidate decides to run for another office in the same municipality and they've already collected 25 endorsement signatures, they can use these again for their endorsement for the other office they are running for. If your municipality does not have a ward system and you decide to run for a different office on the same council or school board, everything from your first campaign can be transferred to the second campaign, and only one financial statement needs to be filed. However, if there is a ward system and your second nomination is in a different ward, then that is considered a separate campaign and two separate financial statements must be filed. Next slide, please. Individuals, corporations, and trade unions may register to be third-party advertisers. There is no registration fee for third-party advertisers. A third-party advertiser would register with the clerk at the local municipality as per the Municipal Elections Act. That requires a notice of registration to be a registered third party for the election. If the notice must be filed in the prescribed form and must include a declaration of qualifications signed by the individual or by a representative of the corporation or trade union, as the case may be. Once registered, the TPA, or third-party advertiser, can advertise in support or opposition of any candidate being elected by voters in that municipality. This would include council positions, trustee positions, or upper-tier candidates. Any person or entity may advertise regarding any issue related to elections in that municipality without registering. However, to advertise regarding questions on the ballot, that requires registration as a third-party advertiser. For a regular election, the registration cannot be filed earlier than the first day for filing nominations, and it cannot be filed later than the Friday before voting day during the clerk's office hours. Once the clerk certifies the notice of registration, the individual, corporation, or trade union is a registered third party for the election. If an individual wants to influence voters in more than one municipality, so for example, if they want to influence the school board trustee election and the way voters in the town of Innisfil, township of Tiny and Tay, which is covered by the county of Simcoe, the way they vote, they would have to register in each of the 3 municipalities and conduct their activities as 3 separate campaigns. If a municipality believes and has supporting evidence that there has been a contravention of the Municipal Elections Act by the TPA, then it can ask the third-party advertiser to remove the advertisement or discontinue the advertising. Next slide, please. If an individual is registered as a TPA and then they decide they want to become a candidate and they file a nomination as a candidate, their third-party advertiser registration is deemed to be withdrawn and their advertising campaign would automatically end when they file the candidate nomination. However, if you are a person working in a corporation or trade union that has registered to become a TPA and you decide to run and become a candidate, it does not impact that corporation because you are separate from the corporation. So for example, if I, as an individual, register to become a TPA and I decide I want to run for a councillor position and I file a nomination, my TPA campaign automatically ends. But if I work as an accountant for XYZ company and XYZ company registers as a TPA, I can still freely register to become a candidate and nothing happens to XYZ company, even though I work for them. Because again, we are 2 separate entities. So they can continue to do their advertising and I can continue to do mine. However, if this situation was real, I would be very careful to keep myself separate from XYZ company and their third-party campaigning so I don't get accused of collaborating with them. Because as I mentioned earlier, TPAs cannot work under the direction of a candidate and vice versa. They must be kept separate. Finances related to a third-party advertising campaign cannot be transferred to a candidate's campaign. Again, using the example of if I first registered as an individual TPA and then I decide I want to run as a candidate, I cannot transfer anything from my TPA campaign to my candidate's campaign. I have to start fresh and they are 2 separate campaigns. Similarly, someone registered as an individual TPA or candidate cannot hand over their campaign to another person. So for example, if I was registered as an individual third-party advertiser, but I have to leave the country for personal reasons, I can't just assign someone else to take my place when I'm the one who registered. I would have to close down my campaign. The registration period for third-party advertisers runs until the Friday before voting day, October 21st, 2022, or the last day the clerk's office is open before voting day in a by-election. Again, as a candidate or TPA or third-party advertiser or school board trustee, make sure you are aware of all the dates and deadlines up until December or further as soon as possible so that you can prepare. If you're not sure of these dates, please reach out to the municipal clerk. Next slide, please. Campaign accounts are only required if the candidate or third-party advertiser raises or spends money. If you know for certain that your campaign will not raise funds, you don't plan on spending money because that's just what you've decided, then you don't need to open a campaign account. Third-party advertisers generally need to follow the same rules for raising campaign funds and financial reporting as candidates for office. Trade unions and corporations are not eligible to contribute to a candidate's campaign, although they can participate in the election as third-party advertisers or make contributions to other third-party advertising campaigns. Municipalities must establish rules and procedures regarding the use of municipal or local board resources, such as the municipality's logo, the municipality's website, municipal printers, etc., for the entire campaign period. So as a candidate, you may also want to make yourself aware of those rules by reaching out to the municipality to ask for them. Again, please refer to the candidate's guide for examples of what is considered a contribution. Next slide, please. It's important to note that contributions from a candidate and their spouse are considered to have come from the same person and count against the self-contribution limit. Both the candidate and contributor are responsible for ensuring that they are following the rules in the Municipal Elections Act. So please inform your contributors of the rules so they can acknowledge them and determine how much or if they can contribute to your campaign. And remember, you must issue a receipt for every contribution you receive. The receipt should show who made that contribution, the date, and the value of the contribution. If the contribution was in goods or services, you must determine the value of the goods or services and issue a receipt for the full value. You are required to return any contribution that was made or accepted in contravention of the Municipal Elections Act as soon as you learn that it was ineligible. If you cannot return the contribution, you must turn it over to the clerk. More information can be found in the TPA or candidate's guide. And remember, the clerk will be preparing a separate report in respect to each contributor who appears to have contravened any of the contribution limits, and they may face penalties under the Municipal Elections Act. So it's important you inform contributors of their limits. When it comes to a corporation providing a contribution to a TPA, if one corporation controls the others directly or indirectly, then they are considered to be the same contributor. If the corporations are owned or controlled by the same person or group of people, again, either directly or indirectly, they are considered to be the same contributor. So for example, if one person owns 3 different restaurants under the name Food Incorporated, a TPA can only accept 1 contribution from Food Incorporated and not 1 contribution from each restaurant, because each restaurant is owned by Food Incorporated. Next slide, please. This slide lists the parties that a candidate or TPA cannot accept a contribution from. Another consideration is volunteers helping your campaign. The value of services provided by volunteers is generally not considered to be a contribution. However, if the volunteer is a professional, so for example, an accountant or a lawyer, and they volunteer to provide services for which they would normally be paid, the market value of the service must be recorded as a contribution by the volunteer, and it becomes a campaign expense for you as a candidate. So for example, if you have a friend who's an accountant and they're helping you by keeping your records, you have to list his or her time as a contribution. So if they usually charge $30 including tax per hour, and they spent 5 hours on your campaign, you have to include $150 as a contribution from them, as well as an expense on your end. Even though you didn't transfer the money and your friend is doing it, as a favor, you still have to include that information in your financial statement. If you encounter this situation during your campaign and you have questions, again, please feel free to contact us at any time. As mentioned previously, only third-party advertisers can accept contributions from corporations and unions. Next slide, please. Campaign contributions are money, goods, services given to a candidate for his or her election campaign. Cash contributions may only be accepted up to $25. Contributions more than $25 must be made by check, money order, or a method that clearly shows where the funds came from. So remember, you must keep the following campaign records: receipts issued for every contribution, including when you accepted the contribution and the date you issued the receipt. Remember to issue your receipts for yourself and any contributions you make as well. The value of every contribution, whether it's in the form of money or goods or services, as well as the contributor's name and address, receipts obtained for each expense, any claim for payment of an expense that the campaign disputes or refuses to pay. So even though you haven't paid it, you still have to include that claim for payment. The funds raised and expenses incurred from each separate fundraising event or activity, the terms of any loan received from a bank or other recognized lending institution. I would also encourage you to take a look at the financial forms now so you get an idea of where you'll be recording this information and how it will be recorded. And if you are unsure, feel free to ask us or the clerk in advance. As well, you can always seek advice from an accountant. Fundraising functions are events or activities held by or on behalf of a candidate for the primary purpose of raising money for the candidate's campaign. The price of admission to a fundraising function is a campaign contribution, and a receipt must be issued for the full amount. Money raised by events at a fundraising campaign, like a raffle or selling baked goods, must also be recorded as contributions. The contribution is the difference between the market value and what you are selling it for. So for example, if I bought cookies for $1, but I'm selling them for $5 at my fundraising event, each person that bought a cookie contributed $4 to my campaign. Receipts must be issued for every contribution over $25 during a fundraising activity or campaign, and must contain the name and address of the contributor and the amount and date. So for example, instead of the $5 cookies, if I sold t-shirts for $50 and I bought the shirt for $1, payment would have to be given by check or money order from people buying the t-shirts, and I would have to issue a receipt and record the contributor's information. It's very important that you keep these records accurate and safe. Bridget will talk about the compliance audits later in the presentation, and I may refer to this point again, but I am stressing the importance of maintaining your financial records for your own security in case you do have to go through a compliance audit. When in doubt, just record the information and keep it safe. Next slide, please. The limit on contributions to any one candidate or registered third-party advertiser is $1,200, except for the City of Toronto mayor candidates, in which case it's $2,500. The individual contribution amount has increased from $750 to $1,200, but the aggregate amount of $5,000 stays the same. So for example, in one municipality, I can contribute up to $5,000 to various election candidates. So I can give one person $500, another person $1,000, another person $300 until I reach $5,000, but then I have to stop. But also remember that I can only give each person up to $1,200. Once I reach my $5,000 limit in one municipality, I can go to another municipality and do the same thing again. So I can go to the city of Mississauga and give different candidates money until I reach $5,000. I can do it again in Brampton and as many as I please. I wish I was rich enough to have those problems, but I'm not. Since candidates and third-party advertisers are required to inform contributors of contribution limits, you may want to inform them verbally and include the limits on the receipts you provide. You may also want to ask if they've reached their limit, so you're not accepting money that you'll just have to return. But remember, you can't ask them who they contributed to or how much they contributed, but just clarify with them to make sure that they have not given you more than $1,200 and that they have not spent over $5,000 in the municipal election for that specific municipality. Next slide, please. Self-funding limits for municipal council candidates are based on the number of electors voting for the office, up to a maximum of $25,000 per candidate. The formula for calculating the limit is $7,500 plus 20 cents per elector for head of council and $5,000 plus 20 cents per elector for other council offices. Again, this formula is in the slide deck as well as the candidate's guide, so you can refer back to it at any time. The financial slides that we're discussing right now can seem overwhelming and confusing when you hear them, but when you go back and read them again, it may become more clear. And again, if they don't, you can always contact us with your questions. The highest self-funding limit that anyone can possibly have is $25,000. If the formula works out to a number that is over $25,000, you're capped at the $25,000 limit. There is no self-funding limit for school board candidates or third-party advertisers. Next slide, please. If you decide to kickstart your campaign by self-funding it, you are able to reclaim that amount only if you have a surplus at the end of your campaign. So do not contribute. It's assuming that you will get your money back, because you may not. And that's regardless of if that was your own money or a loan you took out. If you do borrow money and get a loan from a bank, the loan is not considered to be campaign income, and paying it back is not a campaign expense. It's considered a self-contribution. However, any interest that you accumulate on that loan for your campaign can be considered a campaign expense. I will now pass it on to Bridget to continue the campaign finance portion of the presentation, starting with campaign expenses. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm starting with campaign expenses. Candidates and third-party advertisers should familiarize themselves with campaign expense provisions and know what constitutes an expense under the spending limits. These can be found in the candidate's guide. Campaign expenses are costs that are incurred by the candidate or a person under the candidate's direction, such as a campaign manager, along with a third-party advertiser and their campaign. The nomination fee is a personal expense and not a campaign expense. Therefore, it should not be reported on your financial statement. All expenses must be paid from your campaign bank account, and a receipt must be retained that shows what the expense was for. If you are using a credit card to pay for purchases, you should make sure you keep clear records showing that the expense on the credit card was reimbursed from the campaign account. Candidates are subject to two spending limits, a general limit and a separate limit for expenses relating to parties and expressions of appreciation after voting day at 8 p.m. on that day. The spending limit related to parties and appreciation shall not be greater than 10% of the total spending limit provided by your clerk. Some expenses are not subject to the general spending limit, such as audit and accounting fees, expenses related to recount and compliance audit, and expenses related to holding a fundraising event or activity. Next slide, please. Goods and services donated to the campaign are also expenses and must be reported. A receipt must be provided for fair market value and treated as a contribution. With respect to campaign inventory, if you ran in the last election and want to use leftover goods, such as signs or office supplies, you have to determine the current market value for those goods and record them as an expense in the current campaign. Also, if you end up with leftover inventory at the end of the campaign, it becomes your personal property. But if you want to store them to use in another election, any costs for storage are not considered campaign expenses. Next slide, please. The spending limit formula for candidates and maximum amount for parties after voting day are set out in Ontario Regulation 101/97. The clerk calculates the spending limits twice. The first time upon a candidate filing the nomination form, the clerk will calculate the spending limit based on the number of electors on the voters list as it existed on September 15th, 2018. The second time, the calculation is based on the number of electors on the voters list as it exists on September 15th, 2022. Note that this calculation must be provided to candidates on or before September 25th, 2022. Whichever number is higher is the spending limit, and the clerk's calculation is final. Next slide, please. Candidates will be required to inform their contributors of the contribution limits. For example, how much a contributor can contribute to an individual candidate's campaign being $1,200, and the aggregate limit on contributions to any one council or local board election being $5,000. Final spending limit will be provided to candidates again by September 25th. If a third-party advertiser has registered in more than one municipality, each registration is a separate campaign, as mentioned before, with its own spending limits. If there is a joint purchase spanning over more than one municipality, then portion a reasonable amount for each registration. The campaign finance rules are generally the same for third-party advertisers as they are for candidates. This includes financial filing requirements, requests for extensions, and records. Third-party advertisers are also required to ensure contributions and expenses are tracked and accounted for. Proper record retention, proper direction is provided to those incurring expenses or accepting contributions on their behalf, and that spending limits are adhered to. Next slide, please. Most expenses are subject to this spending limit. Those listed in this slide are not. For example, expenses related to a recount or to a compliance audit. Expenses related to fundraising functions are exempt from the campaign spending limit, but in order to qualify as a fundraising function, an event must have the raising of money as its primary purpose. Campaign events at which incidental fundraising takes place do not qualify as fundraising functions. Similarly, a brochure promoting awareness of a candidate that contains contact information to make campaign contributions does not qualify as a fundraising function. Expenses that were subject to the spending limit if incurred before voting day are not subject to the spending limit if incurred after voting day. For example, expenses related to a compliance audit, a court action for a controverted election, expenses incurred after voting day. Next slide, please. Third-party advertisers will be subject to two spending limits, a general spending limit and a separate limit for expenses related to parties and expressions of appreciation after the close of voting. The Municipal Elections Act also provides that the spending limit for parties and other expressions of appreciation after voting day be set at 10% of the general spending limit. This would be consistent with the spending limit in place for candidates. Next slide, please. As a candidate or a third-party advertiser, it is important that you be fully aware of the responsibilities regarding election spending and accepting campaign contributions. The Candidate's Guide is a good resource, as well as sections 88.8 to 88.21 of the Municipal Elections Act, and be familiar with the financial statements that you will be required to complete at the end of your campaign period. This will help guide you in organizing your records and how they have to be reported. A question we are asked each municipal election is whether there is a requirement for every candidate to have a chief financial officer. The answer is no. You are required under the Municipal Elections Act to keep accurate records and open a campaign bank account if you are spending any money or accepting any contributions. A bank account is not required if a candidate or third-party advertiser does not receive or spend any money. Next slide, please. Candidates and third-party advertisers are required to keep complete and accurate financial statements during the course of their campaigns. All contributions and expenses are to be accounted for and disclosed by the candidate on the relevant prescribed financial form. All candidates and third-party advertisers are required to keep all original campaign financial records until November 15th, 2026, when a new council takes office. These rules apply whether you are elected or not. Next slide, please. Store receipts in a secure place, as they are valuable documents, and they may need to be produced in the event of a compliance audit. Receipts must be signed by the candidate or his or her designate. It is good practice to have a receipt that is multi-part form, one for the contributor and one or more for the candidate's records. Receipts should be numbered in sequence. Open a bank account which provides monthly statements and canceled checks. Produce duplicate deposit slips for each deposit, listing the names of the contributors and the amounts received from each. Ensure a very good record is kept of all contributions, as sometimes a contributor makes numerous contributions and may reach the $100 limit, where they will need to be identified within the financial statement. Maintain a petty cash fund to handle minor expenses and obtain invoices to support all payments from the fund. At any time, the cash on hand plus the total amount of the invoices should equal the original amount of the petty cash fund. The fund can be replenished periodically by a check drawn on the campaign account in an amount equal to the total amount of the invoices. Candidates and third-party advertisers may find it useful to look over the financial statements being Form 4 for candidates and Form 8 for third-party advertisers, respectively, at the beginning of their campaign to give them an idea of what information will be needed to report on at the end of the campaign. Requirements under the Municipal Elections Act states you must maintain original records until November 15th, 2026. Next slide, please. It is recommended for candidates to contact their municipality, both upper and lower, to ask about bylaws relating to signs and campaigning. The period for third-party advertisements, as shown on the slide, is the period when the rules applies. In 2022, that is from May 1st, 2022 until the close of voting at 8 p.m. on October 24th, 2022. Third-party advertisers and candidates are required to identify themselves on signs and advertisements. The Municipal Elections Act references for advertising is Section 88.3 for candidates and 88.4 for third-party advertisers. Next slide, please. The broadcaster or publisher of a third party or candidate advertisement shall maintain records containing the following information for a period of 4 years for the public to inspect: the name of the candidate or registered third party advertiser, name, business address, and telephone number of the individual who deals with the broadcaster or publisher under the direction of the candidate or third party advertiser, copy of the advertisement or the means of reproducing it for inspection, a statement of the charge made for its appearance. Next slide, please. Section 88.25 of the Municipal Elections Act states all candidates are required to file Form 4 with the clerk, regardless of how much or how little they spent or fundraised. If you filed a nomination form, you must file a Form 4. This form is required even if you withdrew your nomination or you were acclaimed. If you registered as a third-party advertiser, you must complete Form 8. A candidate may resubmit a financial statement to correct an error up until the filing deadline of March 31st. The clerk is required to make public a report that states which candidates filed financial statements and which did not. Next slide, please. The appointment of an auditor by the candidate is mandatory if expenses or contributions exceed $10,000. Auditor must be licensed under the Public Accounting Act 2004. Note that the campaign statements are public documents and anyone contributing $100 or more will be identified on the financial statement. That will be a public document. Next slide, please. Candidates can file their financial documents at any time after voting day to January 3rd. Filing the financial statement ends the campaign period. This will make it easier for acclamations and campaigns where little or no expenses were incurred. Clerks will be required to report whether candidates have met their financial filing obligation and publish a report on the municipal website or in another electronic form. This needs to be done by April 30th in the case of a regular election or within 90 days of a by-election. Clerks can determine the conditions for the electronic filing of financial statements if that's permitted. Next slide, please. The nomination fee is only refundable if the financial statement is filed on time. A candidate or third-party advertiser who misses the filing deadline may file within the 30-day grace period, provided a $500 late fee is paid to the municipality. Just to note, a candidate who chooses to file within that 30-day grace period will be subject to both a $500 late filing fee as well as the loss of their nomination refund. A candidate or third-party advertiser may resubmit a financial statement to correct an error up until the filing deadline of March 31st. Next slide, please. When filing the financial statement, a candidate or third-party advertiser with a campaign surplus must pay the entire amount to the clerk. Prior to paying over any surplus funds to the clerk, a candidate or third-party advertiser is entitled to a refund of any contributions they or their spouse made to the campaign, not to anybody else. The amount that may be refunded is the lesser of the amount of the relevant contribution or the amount of the surplus. For example, if there is a surplus of $500 and the total contributions made by the candidate was $400, the candidate would be entitled to $400 and the remaining $100 would be given to the clerk of the municipality. The clerk is required to place surplus monies in trust for use by the candidate or third-party advertiser if they need it for a compliance audit. If neither the candidate or third-party advertiser requires the funds for these purposes, it becomes the property of the municipality or school board. Next slide, please. Every council and school board must establish a compliance audit committee. Members of a compliance audit committee cannot be members of the council or school board, an employee, a candidate in the election, or a registered third-party advertiser. clerk to review contributions and to prepare a report for consideration by the Compliance Audit Committee if a contributor appears to have exceeded any contribution limits. This process is related to reviewing contributions as reported on the financial statements and is not connected to the compliance audit process. If it is apparent to the clerk that a contributor has exceeded one or more of the contribution limits, the clerk would report this to the committee, which would meet to determine whether to proceed with legal action. The legislation does not specify what details are to be provided in the report to the committee. Electors are entitled to vote in an election. Electors entitled to vote in an election may apply for a compliance audit even if the candidate has not filed their financial statements. The application must be in writing and set out the electors' reasons for why they believe the Municipal Elections Act has been contravened. The application must be submitted to the municipal clerk or the secretary of the school board within 90 days of the filing deadline. The Compliance Audit Committee will consider the application and decide whether to retain an auditor to undertake a compliance audit of the candidate's financial return. Next slide, please. The Compliance Audit Committee is required to provide brief written reasons for its decision. Compliance Audit Committee meetings are required to be open to the public, but the committee may deliberate in private. Electors can apply for a compliance audit of a third-party advertiser's campaign finances as well. The minister has the authority to make a regulation setting out qualifications for Compliance Audit Committee members. The written reasons for the committee's decision shall be given to the candidate, the clerk with whom the candidate filed his or her nomination, the secretary of the local school board, if applicable, and the applicant. If an audit occurs, the report must be circulated to the same individuals. The Campaign Audit Committee considers the auditor's report. If the compliance audit determines there has been an apparent contravention of the Municipal Elections Act, the committee will decide whether to proceed with legal action. Decisions of the committee may be appealed to the Superior Court of Justice. A person who believes that a candidate has contravened the Municipal Elections Act may proceed with legal action without having first obtained a compliance audit. Next slide, please. An offense as described in section 90, subsection 3, defines a corrupt practice and a person who commits it on conviction disqualified from voting at an election until the next regular election has taken place after the election to which the offense relates, in addition to being liable to any other penalty provided for in this action. Next slide, please. In general, the penalties listed in this slide are available to the courts upon conviction for an offense under the Municipal Elections Act. Just to note, ineligibility to vote is a penalty if you are convicted of a corrupt practice. This is laid out in section 90 of the Municipal Elections Act. Next slide, please. Section 23 states the clerk shall not provide a copy of the voters list under subsection 3 or a part of the voters list under subsection 4 until September 1st. Next slide, please. Candidates running an award are entitled only to that portion of the list that contains the names of the electors entitled to vote for that office. If asked on written request, the clerk shall provide a copy of the voters list to the secretary of the school board, the clerk of the municipality responsible for conducting the school board elections for the area, upper tier clerk if members are required to be elected at an election conducted by the clerk or that has submitted a bylaw or question to the electors, the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing if the minister has submitted a question to the electors, which is very rare. Candidates can only receive part of the voters list that contains the names of electors entitled to vote for that office. For example, if there are wards, the ward candidate would be entitled only to the ward portion of the voters list. Next slide, please. The clerk may require anyone that has received a copy of the voters list to sign a receipt acknowledging the list is only to be used for the election purposes, and any other use would be in violation of the Municipal Elections Act. In a ward system, an elector is entitled to vote only in the ward where he or she resides. Next slide, please. There are a number of reasons why someone would appoint someone else to vote on their behalf, including an absence from the area, an illness, etc. No appointments for proxies are made until all nominations are closed. Assignment of proxy vote is the responsibility of an eligible voter to appoint an identified eligible voter. An eligible proxy may exercise only one proxy vote unless the proxy is acting on behalf of a spouse, sibling, parent, child, grandparent, or grandchild. Proxy forms must have original signatures. Please check with the municipal clerk if proxy voting is available, as municipalities that use alternate voting may not permit proxy voting. Next slide, please. Only a candidate may appoint scrutineers to represent him or her during the voting and the counting of votes, including during a recount. Third-party advertisers cannot appoint scrutineers. In the traditional election where voting takes place at the poll, the deputy returning officer is in charge of the activity in the voting place, and the DRO may ask the scrutineer to leave if the scrutineer is not complying with the legislation. Candidates or scrutineers should respect that the DRO must ensure fairness, access, privacy, and security of the vote, and absolutely no campaigning within the voting place. This means scrutineers cannot enter the voting place wearing a pin or a shirt with any reference to candidates. A useful tip is to check with the clerk to see if a list of scrutineers' rights is being given to election staff at the poll. If so, use that list or prepare your own and hand out to each of your scrutineers a list of their rights, which are spelled out in section 47(5) of the Municipal Elections Act. There are no age restrictions for scrutineers. Next slide, please. A recount is automatic if the vote is tied. Councils and school boards have the option of establishing policies prior to the election and also allow for an automatic recount. Council still retains the option to pass a resolution for a recount within 30 days after the clerk has declared the results of the election. An eligible elector can apply to the courts for a recount within 30 days of the clerk's declaration of the results. Next slide, please. So this lays out the key dates to look for. Voting day is Monday, October 24th, 2022, between 10 a.m. and 8 p.m. The campaign period, the time when a candidate can accept contributions and incur election expenses, runs from the date of the nomination is submitted and up until January 3rd, 2023. The campaign period, the time the third-party advertiser can incur expenses, begins on the date their registration is certified. Earliest date is May 1st, 2022 until January 3rd, 2023. The deadline for filing of the campaign financial statement in the clerk's office is Friday, March 31st, 2023, no later than 2 p.m. All candidates and third-party advertisers must file this statement regardless of how much they spent or received in contributions. Next slide, please. So this is a list of resources. This lists are available to you in order to be prepared for your campaign. The first section is of links will take you to the eLaws website, where all provincial legislation is available online, including the associated regulations. You will want to be very familiar with the Municipal Elections Act, the Municipal Act, the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, and if running for school board, the Education Act. The second section of links is to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing website. From this site, you will be able to access the 2022 Voters Guide, Candidates Guide, and the Third-Party Advertisers Guide. And then the next part is once you access the Municipal World website, you will find a list of books that will also assist you in your campaign. And next slide, please.
Okay, so we have now come to the conclusion of the presentation. I know that was a lot of information to take in, so thank you so much for your time and attention. We will now be taking questions, but again, if you prefer to ask your question privately, or if you think of a question later on, please feel free to contact me at any time and I'd be happy to help. My contact information is listed on the slide. So with that, I will actually pass it on to Patty to moderate the question period.
Great job, Bridget. Great job, Sab. Wonderful to have you here this evening. So we haven't had, you guys must have done a wonderful job because we only have a couple of questions. The first question is there a special form that lists the 25 names of people endorsing your nomination, or can this list be on any document or paper?
So there is actually a document. It's called Form 2, and it's available on the Candidates Guide. There is a link, or you can download it from the Government of Ontario Central Form Repository. And I believe the municipalities do have that link available on their websites as well.
Wonderful. Next question. I am confused about the relationship between fundraising events and my spending limit, since tickets count as a campaign contribution. Please clarify.
Okay. So that's a great question. Those are all three kind of different items though. So a fundraising event is an event with the primary purpose of raising funds. So it's not to endorse yourself as a candidate, but it's to get money for your campaign. Your spending limit covers all the expenses that you incur from the day you fill your nomination filing up until voting day. And then the raffle ticket to enter a fundraising event is considered a contribution because the person is basically supporting you and supporting your fundraising event by giving you that money. Except instead of just giving you the money and getting nothing in return, they get to attend your fundraising event. So that's why it's actually considered a contribution. I hope that clarifies it. If there's any follow-up questions, please feel free to include those.
We have one more question. How is the $25 or lower cash donations recorded on the financial statement?
So on the statement, there is a section. Bridget, do you want to go into detail about the forms?
Yeah. So all contributions that you receive have to be recorded with a receipt. Doesn't matter how much what the amount is. The only time it doesn't have to be included is during the fundraising event. If you have a pass the hat, and it has to be under $25, but every contribution you accept and outside of the fundraising event has to be recorded and documented as a contribution. Does that,
Okay.
that explains it?
Next question. Can your auditor, if you spend over $10,000, also be your campaign CFO?
I believe they can. I don't think there's anything to prevent that.
And that is all the questions that we have this evening. And thank you again for joining us. You guys did a great job, and I'm sure we'll be talking with you over the coming months. I'd like to also thank everyone for participating this evening. And just a reminder that this session was recorded and it is available through your clerk's office or maybe posted on their website if you wish to review it. You can also request a copy of the PowerPoint as well. And just a reminder, we'll be accepting nominations commencing May 2nd, running right through until August 19th. And we look forward to meeting with you in person. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great evening. And one more time, any other questions can be directed through the clerk's office or through the ministry to our wonderful municipal advisors who joined us this evening. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.